Hello, welcome to our special coverage of the Putin-Biden summit. I'm Stan Grant. Coming up, we talk to former Australian Foreign Minister Julie Bishop about coming face-to-face with Russian President Vladimir Putin, and we'll have a panel discussion with diplomatic experts and a cyber security analyst. Well, no kumbaya and no hostility, but that was about the best thing to come out of the summit between Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden. The presidents of the US and Russia have praised the first meeting between the two nuclear superpowers since 2018, but there was little real progress. Both sides agreed to begin dialogue on nuclear arms control, and they will also return ambassadors to each other's capitals. Well, the leaders held separate press conferences after the 4-hour summit in Geneva. President Biden says they both spoke constructively and, quote, in excruciating detail. But topics such as human rights and cybersecurity were not open to compromise.
No president of the United States could keep faith with the American people if they did not speak out to defend our democratic values. Human rights is going to always be on the table, I told them.
I believe that there was no hostility. On the contrary, our meeting, of course, took place in a principled manner. Our assessments of many points differ, but in my opinion, both sides demonstrated a desire to understand each other and look for ways to bring their positions closer. The conversation was very constructive.
Well, let's get some reaction now from the US Capitol in Washington. We're joined by our correspondent, Greg Jennett. Greg, after the meeting, no reset, no great breakthrough, but where does it go to from here?
There's a bit to pick apart here, isn't there, Stan? There's the feel-good factor, or if you like, the vibe of the interpersonal relationship between the two leaders. Let's set that aside for one moment and talk about the other aspect, which is the body of work that falls to officials to get on with. This is what is often in the game called deliverables, and you've already mentioned some of them, but let's just run through that list as factual examples of what has come from this summit. So that is a body of officials to work on nuclear cooperation so that, let's face it, the biggest nuclear arsenals on the world can be responsibly managed and not proliferated too fast, not on their part anyway. That might then have a knock-on effect, if successful as discussions, by setting an example to China to also join some sort of agreement into the future. There's cyber security, where we're told by both sides that they do see the potential consequences for themselves. Sure, America has had the most high-profile ransomware attacks recently, but Joe Biden's pointing out that that could just as easily happen to Russia. He went a little bit further too. He said if they didn't curb their behaviour there, don't forget we have unspecified capabilities of our own here, the threat being that we would unleash them on Russia if push comes to shove. There's prisoner exchange work too, and then the return of diplomats, which will happen fairly quickly. So they're your measurable deliverables, if you like, but far more importantly, if we take the lead from both of these presidents, is that interpersonal relationship. And they're up front there saying that although cautious and not counting their chickens or anything, they do think the foundations are there for these two leaders to stay in contact and build an understanding about where their red lines are and when they're crossed, what the consequences will be. If that's true, we only have their word to go by, Stan, then that's not a bad day's work at all.
Yeah, and it's really critical, isn't it, Greg, about when this meeting takes place and the background to this. Joe Biden has already cast this era as one about democracy versus autocracy. It's too soon to say who's winning in that tussle, but this is really an ideological moment, isn't it?
It is, and I think we might generously call this a one-all draw in the first half. maybe it's not even the first half. There'll be rematches and penalty shootouts still to come, because this is an epic struggle for the century. That's how Joe Biden defines it. And there, funnily enough, he thinks, Stan, that he has a willing partner in Vladimir Putin, that we now have the adults in the room. Whether you're the Democrat, whether you're the autocrat, he's trying to present this as a non-Trumpian era of international cooperation where there's something in this for both of them. They endured a Cold War, did Russia and America. China, he thinks, poses risks to Russia, even if it doesn't admit them. And for these reasons, he reckons he's got Vladimir Putin somewhat corralled. Then there's the separate matter of, has Russia bitten off more than it can chew in the Middle East? And might America be able to assist in various forms of cooperation there? So democracy v autocracy, pretty evenly balanced now, but stay tuned for the further matches on that front. And look, if today was as successful as it seems, Stan, it's highly likely that although Biden and Putin won't be going to the Kremlin or the White House by invitation, vice versa, it is highly likely that they're going to have ongoing contact at summits, broader ones, G20s, APEC, etc., but also that all-important ability to pick up the phone. And Biden really stresses that interpersonal is everything in international relations.
Greg, thank you. Greg Jennett joining us there from Washington. Well, joining us now is former Australian Foreign Minister Julie Bishop. Julie Bishop, thank you so much for your time. Before we get to what did or did not come out of this summit, you're someone who knows what it's like to sit across the table from Vladimir Putin, and you can take us as close to a fly on the wall as anyone. What is it like to try to approach a negotiation or a discussion with Vladimir Putin?
Vladimir Putin is a very reserved man, but the usual approach of Russian diplomacy is to throw the interlocutor off their game. So they like to unsettle you, and they do that, and Vladimir Putin is a master at this, by making claims or allegations that might be half true. There might be some truth in it, but it really unsettles you. So Russian diplomacy is quite different. They're not about trying to make friends. They're actually about trying to disrupt relations. So I imagine that while President Biden would have been very keen to build a relationship with President Putin, he would be much more reserved. He has quite a sardonic sense of humour as well, which is in great contrast to Joe Biden, who is very charming, very warm, very folksy. I agree. I would love to have been a fly on the wall because I have seen Russian diplomacy in action, up close and personal.
He's always seemed to me as someone who innately understands the expression of power, and I suppose that goes to what you said there about that ability to unsettle. Using the vernacular of the time, the word that was in common usage, shirt front, you had to at the time of the MH17. And how did you deal with that? If you were unsettled, how do you make those points and try to get some sort of a productive outcome, if that is at all possible?
In the case of MH17, as hard as Russia tried, they were always on the back foot because there was overwhelming evidence to show that Russia, at the very least, was involved in supplying the Buk missile to the Ukrainian separatists that shot down Malaysian Airlines MH17. Russia propaganda was working overtime, trying to accuse everybody and anything else for this tragedy. But when I approached President Putin at this meeting in Milan, when we were sitting around a rather large oval table and there were no other advisors in the room, this was a very unique situation. Only interpreters were allowed to be with the leaders in that room. I took the opportunity to walk around the table, tap him on the shoulder and speak to him. At that moment, his interpreter had left the room, so he was alone. And he listened very carefully to what I had to say. So he didn't try to make accusations or disrupt me or unsettle me. He actually listened. But he listens in the most intense way. His steely blue eyes did not ever leave my face. And as I went through my very well-rehearsed lines, I can assure you, as to the point I was trying to make about Russia having to take responsibility for this commercial airline tragedy, he just listened. He understood every word because he replied in English and he was very fluent. By the time his interpreter came back and interrupted the conversation, because he'd obviously left his president alone, we had come to an understanding that Australia and its supporters, the Netherlands and others, were very disturbed that Russia was seeking to avoid responsibility. Although he did say at the end of my speech, he did say, "So this is what you call a shirt front."
Well, you've been
that sense of humour.
You've been known for a steely glare yourself, so I'm sure you gave as good as you got in that instance. But let's look at this summit. It went in with low expectations, and I suppose in a cynical way you could say it met them. But was the fact that the meeting took place at all the really significant thing here?
I think that's right, Stan. This was always going to be a challenging summit. The expectations were low. These two nations have a long history of ideological, geostrategic, geopolitical conflict. The United States has taken Russia to task over numerous issues, including the annexation of Crimea, the backing of Ukrainian separatists, its interference in Syria, and then, of course, the allegations of hacking campaigns against American interests, interference in the US elections, even allegations of the use of microwave energy against US officials in various parts of the world, human rights abuses. So there are many issues of contention. And these two nations both have a long history of dealing with each other. The US State Department is very well versed in Russia's way of doing things, its modus operandi, and likewise Russians with the United States. So there's a long history here, but the fact that the dialogue occurred at all is somewhat of a breakthrough. I don't believe either would have yielded on the core issues, although President Biden did withdraw US sanctions over the Nord Stream 2 pipeline from Russia to Germany. But the issue of sanctions would have been uppermost on Russia's mind. And of course, the great power competition between the United States and China would no doubt have been a topic of much interest between the two.
It's fascinating that you raised that question of China, because China and Russia have grown much closer as well in recent times. And broadly, both China and Russia, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, believe that the West and the United States is in a state of terminal decline, and that creates opportunities for them. Many have cast this as a new Cold War era, and Joe Biden has talked about that line between democracy and autocracy. So what is a pathway forward when you're dealing with two big powers, Russia and China, with their own interests, assertiveness, even aggression, and a period where relations with those countries are at an all-time low, or certainly at a low not seen since the Cold War?
Well, Russia will certainly take advantage of the fact that there is this increasing power competition between the United States and China. It's in Russia's interests for the United States to be distracted by China. But not even Russia would want the US-China relationship to spiral down, because that would impact on the global economy, into which Russia exports much energy. So there would be a line that Russia would not want to cross. But in the meantime, they would be taking advantage of the US-China competition. And yes, you're right, at this moment in history, Russia is seeking to align its interests with China and playing into that narrative that China, and therefore an autocracy like Russia, is on the rise, and that the United States is on an inevitable decline. I don't subscribe to that theory at all. And it overlooks the fact that the United States has an extraordinary network of allies around the world. It has nation after nation it can call upon to back it, to support it, not only militarily, but in terms of support for the US way of doing things, an open liberal democracy, a supporter of democratic institutions, the rule of law, and human rights. So there are many countries around the world that want to see more US leadership, not less, even though they are trading partners with China. It is an interesting ideological time. I don't put it in the context of a Cold War because China is certainly not the former USSR. China is an integral part of the global economy, whereas the USSR was an isolated, essentially an island. Chinese people pre-COVID were travelling around the world in record numbers as tourists, as international students, as business people, whereas the former USSR was virtually closed to the world. So it's a very different scenario, but nevertheless that ideological battle for the hearts and minds between democracy and autocracy is very real.
So we've been down this path before. George W. Bush tried to reset relations with Russia, as did Barack Obama. Donald Trump had his own, unique approach to this and seeking direct meetings with Putin, with no one else in the room. And now we have Joe Biden. All the while, Vladimir Putin, some have said, has played a weak hand very well and is certainly assertive in the Middle East, incursions into Ukraine, annexation of Crimea, occupation of Georgia. We could go on and on. Is it too much to hope for a reset? And if that is the case, where does it go to from here? If there is anything to take away from the meeting, what is there to build on to at least improve that relationship and negotiate what is strategically a very volatile time?
It is very difficult to see common interests between the United States and Russia, although, as I said earlier, they are all part of a global economy now. Even Russia, unlike the former USSR, even Russia is part of the global economy, particularly through its energy exports. So I think the term mutually assured destruction can be applied here in an economic sense. We are all interconnected through the global economy. And so on that basis, you don't want a massive economic power like the United States to fail. It is still the biggest consumer market in the world. But likewise, you have to take account of the fact that China is an increasingly significant part of that global economy. And I think Russia, and certainly President Putin, would be able to see that and seek to balance it. He won't push it too far, although he's determined to back what he believes to be Russia's core interests. I think that there are areas where they could try and find some common ground, whether it's talking about renewable energy, whether it's talking about climate change, whether it's artificial intelligence and trying to get some agreement on a framework for the use of AI around the world. There could be some areas where the United States and Russia have common ground. I think Joe Biden's approach to be more of a friend than a foe may well work for the time being, but as is always the case with Russia, it's a day-by-day situation as to where they will eventually land on a particular issue. They are expert at playing the role of global spoiler. That's what they do. I've watched them at the United Nations Security Council, and just when you think there's an agreement on an issue, Russia will interrupt and spoil the discussions. They disrupt, they spoil, they unsettle, but that's their form of diplomacy and, in their minds, a form of survival.
Just a final thought from you too, if I may. In terms of Australia's interests and role here in this hinge point of history, this ideological moment, what do you see the role Australia plays and its interests in this moment?
What is happening at present is a challenge to the rules-based international order. And by that I mean the framework of treaties and conventions and connections and networks that has evolved since the Second World War. underpinned by international law. Most nations around the world have benefited from this US-backed, guaranteed initiative of a rules-based international order. Australia, in particular, has benefited from the last 70, 75 years of relative stability in the sense that we haven't had a third global conflict. I believe that Australia should continue to defend and promote and advocate for a rules-based order that applies to all nations, and that we should work with like-minded countries, particularly in our region, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, others, as well as our friends around the world, to continue to promote that rules-based order where all nations abide by a set of rules internally and towards each other, how they behave. I think that's probably the most useful role Australia could play in defending, advocating and promoting that all nations adhere to that rules-based order. It's not perfect. It needs to evolve. It certainly needs to take account of China's rise. But unless there are a set of rules, then the result is conflict.
Julie Bishop, I thank you again for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Stan.
We've got a great panel to pick apart this summit between Biden and Putin. Let's get to them now. Alexei Muraviev is a senior lecturer in national security and international relations from Curtin University. Dr. Emma Shortis is a research fellow at RMIT, and Professor Richard Buckland from University of New South Wales, an expert in cybercrime, a critical part of this relationship between Russia and the United States, also cyber war and cyber terror. Good to have all of you with us. And Emma, I wanted to go to you first. Joe Biden has said that there was no kumbaya moment. I don't think he was even expecting one, but he did what he went there to do. What was that?
Look, I think you're right. He went there to demonstrate, I think, that the United States was back, that the grown-ups are back in charge, that considered diplomacy is the kind of new order of the day. And I think he's been very successful in demonstrating that in this meeting with Putin, but also more broadly across this meetings with NATO and with the G7. So I think the visit has been framed very successfully that way, and low expectations were set and they were met. Indeed.
Alexei, going into this, Joe Biden had described Vladimir Putin as a killer. I know that Vladimir Putin would have been aware of that. What would he have gone into this meeting expecting and seeking to achieve?
Well, first of all, Vladimir Putin revealed that shortly after that controversial remark, apparently Joe Biden called him and explained himself. So Putin came into the meeting, at least this is how he described, with a feeling he understood what Joe Biden meant. And he was relatively relaxed about that. But also he didn't come with any sort of high expectations, and he was making it very clear prior to the meeting and during the press conference that he didn't expect any major breakthroughs. He wanted to establish rules of engagement. He wanted to hear his counterpart. He wanted to start the conversation and obviously make sure it doesn't take 3 years for them to resume the dialogue, given the fact that the last time he met with his U.S. counterpart was in 2018. So he had his agenda. He probably knew what Joe Biden is going to bring in the conversation. He was ready to respond, and obviously he highlighted the fact that he was talking to someone who is really experienced, who is a master of diplomacy. So he felt very relaxed about talking to someone who would be of the same sort of caliber as him.
But Alexei, let's be real about this, though. Vladimir Putin has been to this dance before. He's seen off other presidents before. He continues to pursue his own interests. He believes fundamentally that the United States is in decline. So what does he seek out of this? Or is he just going to continue to pursue what he believes is in his and Russia's interest, whatever the cost of that may be?
Well, I think you nailed it here, Stan. Putin obviously will continue to pursue his course. We need to remember that Russia created its own list of unwelcome states or unfriendly states, and currently the list comprises two countries. One is the United States, another one is Czech Republic. And shortly after the conversation, his press secretary was asked whether Moscow was willing to remove now the United States from that list, and his response was it was premature to do that. So Putin has no illusions about or expectations about changing his behavior, changing Russia's strategic course simply because they had a pragmatic and pretty robust conversation with Joe Biden. He understands that the United States is not the power it used to be when he came to his office in the Kremlin 20 years ago. He understands that one way or another, unless there's going to be a rapid change in U.S. approaches to Russia, including lifting of sanctions, Russia has nothing else to lose. So I think the attitude in the Kremlin that's been quite evident over some time is why we should be restraining ourselves. You know, the worst is already here. You know, I mean, anything that can be much worse to the current state of problems is effectively full breakup of diplomatic ties and open confrontation. So I think in this situation, the Russians don't really feel really restrained about what they are doing or what they will continue to do. I think the return of ambassadors to both Washington and Moscow would allow the two countries to resume at least established diplomatic channels. But it's not to say that diplomacy would return back to normality, because Russia is bringing up the issue of its diplomatic property in the United States being seized, and they want it to be returned before any other sort of dialogue, at least by using established diplomatic channels, would be resumed. So we're definitely not out of the debris, and the two countries are definitely not out of the debris that's been created over the past years.
Richard, hold tight. I'm going to come to you in a minute on cybersecurity. I just want to go to Emma. If Vladimir Putin has no illusions, then surely Joe Biden has none either. We've been down this road. George W. Bush famously looked into the eyes of Vladimir Putin and saw his soul. He thought he would reset the relationship. Barack Obama thought he would reset the relationship. Donald Trump tried another approach, and it was direct negotiations. No one else in the room. So there are no illusions here, are there, when Joe Biden looks at Vladimir Putin about what can be achieved? So what is a bottom line outcome here for Joe Biden?
Look, I think for Joe Biden, this was, for want of a better word, I know it's been used many times before, this was about a reset. This was about starting as he means to go on. But as you say, Stan, he has no illusions about Russia or about Putin. We've got to remember that Biden is a veteran of foreign affairs. You know, he was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for a long time. He's a veteran of the Cold War. So I think is accustomed to this very kind of slow, painstaking diplomacy, and that's why, you know, he said he was so over-prepared for this meeting, for the kind of excruciating detail that they were going to have to go through when it came to the number of issues that the United States and Russia need to work through. So there are no illusions there. But I also think that Biden does have hope. You know, he's a very optimistic president about the relationship going forward and the potential, you know, not to be friends, not to have any kind of illusions in that sense, but to establish considered diplomacy and strategic diplomacy to reopen those channels. You know, as Alexei said, having the ambassadors return is really important, to have those lines of communication open, which again is a Cold War tactic. So when we hear kind of all this speak about the relationship being at its lowest point in years, you know, I've even heard some people say that the relationship is worse than it was during the Cold War. I think that's an exaggeration, and we should be careful kind of not to get too overblown about this situation. I think that this meeting shows that progress is being made. And Putin was on his best behaviour as well. So I think that we can be assured that both parties, you know, while they certainly have their own interests and we'll continue to pursue them, both parties have no interest in the conflict escalating at the moment.
Richard, what does have the whiff of the Cold War, though, is the espionage, the diplomatic to and fro, the tit for tat. We've seen ambassadors sent back to their home countries and other embassy officials expelled from their respective countries, and cyber warfare, cyber attack, that this is a new front in this relationship. Tell us about that and how that plays into this strategic moment between these countries.
Yeah, you're right, Stan. It's like the old nuclear deterrence, nuclear discussion, but it's a bit different with cyber, because before the nuclear was controlled just by the state. Now the attackers are both state and criminals within the country. And before it was all or nothing, use it or not. It was just a threat of use. Whereas now we see attack happening all the time. It is being used now, as we've seen through the big SolarWinds campaign. So this is another level of difficulty, harder for Biden to deal with, I would think. With the nuclear weapon, when Reagan was asked, do you trust the Russians? He said, sure, trust and verify. With nuclear, with nuclear you can. With cyber, you can't verify. You can't know. You can't attribute. So you can attack almost with impunity. So it is very difficult. And we've seen Putin over and over again deny that it is Russia doing these attacks.
Precisely. He does deny, and then says perhaps if it's being sheeted home, it's being sheeted home to criminal interests inside Russia, but it is not state-directed. But what's your assessment of what is actually happening there, as much as you can make that assessment?
So the Australian government's quite good at, the Australian military have been quite good at doing attribution there, but it's very hard to. It's not like you can show a picture of a nuclear weapon in Cuba and say, this is it. When an attack happens, it's very abstract and it goes through multiple changes. It's hard to explain. And it's absolutely true that it seems to be the case that in Russia, Putin has created an environment where cyber criminals aren't really punished and aren't chased by the state. They're basically constrained to not attack Russian targets. And we often see this in the malware. It checks that there isn't a Russian language loaded as a default language before launching the attack. But provided what some people now call privateers, these criminals inside the country, don't attack Russian entities, and provided that they're at Putin's disposal when he asks for them to attack or do things, or hints strongly they should, which we've seen, then he seems happy to turn a blind eye to them, won't extradite them, doesn't prosecute them, and so they flourish. And they really are like privateers, as Cisco said, the old days pirates that were condoned by governments.
So what are there was no breakthrough here when it came to cyber, and no one was expecting anything. And as you say, there is denial. I'd imagine denial on both sides as well when it comes to the use of this sort of activity. But what are the avenues open here for dealing with this, given, as you've said, how opaque it is, how difficult it is to identify the source, and the fact that it's ever changing? How do we deal with this new world and this new front in what may be a Cold War, and some are even saying that it's the first shot in a future war between the West and autocratic regimes? The war begins now in cyberspace.
Yeah. It is called the fifth domain after land, sea, air and space. It's now the fifth domain of war. And it has that same horrible thing that nuclear weapons did, that no longer is war something that happens a long way away at the front, at the Maginot Line, at some sort of barrier between countries. With nuclear weapons, long-range intercontinental missiles, everyone, people at home were at threat. And of course, with cyber, the attackers in Russia, whoever they are, or in China or in any country, are just one step away from your computer on your desk, from your car, from your phone. So, the stakes are very high. This will be where war is fought in the future, in whole, if not in part, if not in whole. So I quite like what Biden did. I think in this situation, which must seem very new and almost hopelessly difficult to America, he seemed to draw a bit of a line in the sand. He said, if there are attacks on these, and it's unclear exactly what he said, but he seems to have identified 16 sectors that are critical infrastructure sectors. If there are attacks on these, then we will respond, is essentially the implied threat that apparently he said, according to him. So that's quite good. That's a line in the sand. Now, before Putin could just watch things happening and say, no, not us, it's not us. But he's saying, I don't care who it is. If this attack happens, we will respond. And the US is incredibly powerful in cyber offensive capabilities. So this is sort of raising the stakes a bit. If I was, it's a bit like mutually assured destruction again. If I was Putin, crazy sentence to say, but I'd be very tempted to back down and tell even the privateers, hang on, just don't attack the energy sector, don't attack defense, don't attack global positioning, don't attack dams or fuel. And then this might work. Just drawing a line over a few specific things, it might be a good first step. In the long run, we need norms, but they're very hard to police and detect if the policing doesn't work.
Yeah, Alexei, can I come back to you? I want to pull back the lens a little bit here and just add a bit of historical context to what we are dealing with. To many observers, there was a missed opportunity with Russia at the end of the Cold War. And this is the narrative that Vladimir Putin offers up. At the end of the Cold War, there were promises made about NATO expansion, encroachment onto Russia's borders, that he says NATO and the West then broke. There was a humiliation of Russia after the fall of the Soviet Empire, that there was a lost opportunity that created a level of hostility. Was there a lost opportunity? Can that be recovered? And to what extent do you give credence to that Putin view of what has led us to this moment?
Look, I think, we can have a debate about whether it was a lost opportunity or not. I think there are two issues that I would like to highlight. One is throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, when the relations between Russia and the West were not as hostile as they were right now, it seemed like the two parties were talking same language, but in different tones, almost like in different parallel universes. They were saying similar things, but they were not hearing each other. And I think that, to some extent, created this problem that gradually grew into what I would now describe as the state of complete mistrust. And I think the ongoing mistrust, because the meeting in Geneva did not break the state of mistrust. It only allowed some sort of a contours of how to go from here, remaining fairly hostile. I mean, there was no declaration that the two countries now reversing their policies, etc. I think there was an admittance that the relationship will continue to be complex, and I think even the discussion about cyber demonstrated attempts to create some sort of established parameters. This is the corridor within which we would continue to operate, but outside of the corridor, things may get really problematic for either side. And actually, speaking of cyber, for example, they just also demonstrates this continuous problem with having a conversation. During the press conference, Putin actually outlined the fact that apparently during the discussion, the issue of the origins of cyber attacks was brought up, and apparently the list of countries from which the majority of attacks takes place was presented, and the top three countries that were on this list was the United States, Canada, and the UK. So once again, we're hearing one side of the story about Biden presenting 16 sectors that are sort of no-go zones for the Russians. We don't know whether the Russians presented with similar lists to Joe Biden, but certainly Putin indicated that he, in his own words, were effectively trying to develop a counter-narrative saying, look, I mean, we're as much of a victim of this ongoing cyber campaign as you guys.
I can see Richard nodding here, and I want to go quickly to Richard for a response to that, and a final word before we finish to Emma as well. Richard?
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, Alexei's spot on. I think it was interesting, from all reports, Biden didn't rule out attacks. He was talking about attacks that caused damage, and left ruled in was espionage and sort of small commercial attacks. So he's really saying don't bring down our power supply. He's not saying don't go onto our networks and gather information. That's not going to be the tripwire, the line in the sand. And I think that's quite clever. And absolutely, there are lots of attacks coming out of the countries that Alexei named. There are lots of attacks coming out of lots of countries, and it's often hard to know which country they're really coming out of. But those attacks don't cripple a power structure, don't bring down energy supplies, don't destroy hospitals. And that's the line, I think, that Biden's trying to draw. Let
me go to Emma for the final word here. Emma, this meeting is cast in a much bigger framework, and that is this, and we've heard it talked about a lot, particularly after the G7, democracy versus autocracy. And we are seeing a closer alignment, even if it's not an alliance, it is certainly a mutual shared interest with China and Russia, both of them identified by the United States as the key big strategic threats. So how do you capture this moment, and what is the road ahead for Joe Biden that factors into Australia's relationships as well? How do we deal with this particular moment in history?
Look, I think this, is very early, of course, in Biden's term, and he is still working on establishing his own Biden doctrine. And I think from the early signs are, as you say, Stan, that he is committed to lining up democracies and to presenting democracies as the best option and kind of presenting them as more appealing than these autocratic states in Russia and China. And the contrast so far in the way that he is approaching Russia to the way that he is approaching China is really significant. And for me, I think the thing to watch will be how successfully Biden can walk this line between being, the leader of the free world, being the beacon, being that shining light upon a hill, but also working on climate change, because Biden has said that the US is back to lead the world on climate change. And acting on climate change is going to have to mean working with these autocratic states. It means working with Russia and it means working with China. And so far, at least, it's not clear to me how Biden is going to manage to walk that line. So I think that, for me at least, is the really important thing to watch, is how Biden manages those potentially quite significant contradictions, which have very serious consequences for the world.
Emma Short, it's fantastic to have you on the program. Alexi, thank you as well. Richard Buckland, a real pleasure. That brings us to the end of this look at this summit. Significant, if not historic. I think the best we can say right now is, as Emma just told us, watch this space. Thank you so much for joining us.